Hi, and welcome back to a deep dive into Matthew's Gospel. I'm Jim Kirby, and I'm your host for this series on Matthew's Gospel, a deep dive into it. This is a program or a channel where we're going to get in there and really get our hands dirty with Matthew's Gospel. And as I've said before, we're trying to do a way of studying Matthew's Gospel that's a little bit more academic, in the sense that we are studying Matthew before we interpret it, and before we decide what it means. We're going to treat it like we would treat any other text and find out as much as we can about the text itself, so that we can have confidence when we're using Matthew's Gospel, and we can know what it means, we can understand what it means, instead of letting somebody else tell us what it means. And obviously, there are many opinions and many interpretations, and most of the time we feel real comfortable with our church or whatever denomination we belong to, their interpretation, but this is an added help. And so in a lot of cases it just validates what churches already have been telling us, but we'll understand it. We'll understand where that knowledge comes from. I want to thank all the comments, all those folks who have left comments. Again, you can email me if you don't want to leave a comment below. jkirby1@me.com. Love to hear from you. Here's one comment. Alert viewer by the name of Bill told me last time that the monitor was not on during the last episode, which thus distracted him, and he could not concentrate on the pearls of wisdom that I was giving to him. Bill, well, you'll notice that the monitor is back on. Now, I don't know what this thing is. I know what it is. It's a lens cover. So we're going to get that out of the way. Anyway, on today's gospel, or today's episode, we're going to talk about who Matthew was. We're going to talk about the legend of Matthew and expand on that a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit about manuscripts. How did Matthew's gospel develop into what we have in our hands when we pick up a Bible? We're also going to talk about his audience. Who is Matthew talking to? So let's get into it now. Let's talk about who Matthew was. And this is what our legend tells us. The problem that we have with Matthew's gospel is he doesn't tell us who he is in his gospel. Maybe we're supposed to assume that, but not like John, not like Luke. Luke has a whole chapter talking about who he is and why he's doing it. But Matthew doesn't claim to be anything other than an observer of his gospel. And so it's a little bit more difficult to come to know the details about who Matthew, the author, was. From the earliest manuscripts from the church fathers, even in the first century, a lifetime after Jesus, this gospel of Matthew was already being accredited to him. The gospel according to Matthew. And so that's a lot of weight for, believing that Matthew, the apostle, the tax collector, is the author of Matthew. And a lot of the manuscripts, we're going to talk about this in a second, all of it has, the ancient manuscripts have the gospel according to Matthew. And so this is just a lifetime after Jesus. And so, that gives a lot of weight to the idea that the tax collector, the apostle, Matthew, one of the 12, is the author. If you notice below on the slides, you'll see who I give credit to for the information. It's a little bit misleading because a lot of this information I've gotten from other places in the past, but this is where it was organized easily for me to grab. I use sources, for instance, John Myers' book, A Marginal Jew. And incidentally, when I was at Tantura in Jerusalem, one of the students there was editing the latest edition of that book. And it was pretty interesting watching that process of editing something like A Marginal Jew by John Meyer. The other book I lean on heavily is a series called Sacropagini by Daniel Harrington. He's a Jesuit, and he has books on every book of the New Testament. And so I like his style. I like the way he does things. And so you can see below on this slide, Bible Archaeology Report. That's an online source. And you can also, there's another source I use, Blue Letter Bible. And this is more about academics and more about scholarship. And so it's more kind of what we're doing. And so I use those sources quite a bit. So what can we deduce about Matthew just by using the Gospels? In Matthew's Gospel, we talked about him being one of the 12, the tax collectors. In Luke's Gospel, we kind of take a leap and we refer to him as Levi. That's what Luke and Mark both call who we assume is Matthew. In Luke, he tells us that Matthew's the son of Alphaeus. And so that's another thing. Being a tax collector, Matthew would have been in the middle of the trade routes. We talked about how stories get passed along. Obviously, Matthew would be right in the thick of it as being a tax collector, and so that suits him well. And so that adds to the weight of Matthew, the tax collector, being the author of Matthew's Gospel. One other note about Matthew's Gospel is after the resurrection, he's not mentioned in the New Testament at all. So Luke, Mark, and John don't talk about Matthew at all, which is kind of curious. Luke has a whole section of the last part of his gospel, and then Acts of the Apostles about what's going on in the early church. Curious that Matthew isn't mentioned by name. So you might ask yourself, who cares? Let's just assume Matthew the Apostle, the tax collector, is the author of the gospel, and let's just move on. Fine, and that's great, and that's what our legend tells us. However, that's not what scholars do. Scholars are always questioning things. And so during the 18th century, that's when the Bible really began to be really studied. Scriptures were really studied then. Source criticism and all these tools that we use now really started to come into play here. And so some of the scholars in the 18th century looked at Matthew's gospel and realized how much he relied on Mark, and because of that they started asking questions like, well, that doesn't really line up time-wise. How can Matthew be the apostle when he's writing it after Mark, etc.? So they had questions about the timing of all this and whether Matthew actually could be the tax collector and one of the apostles. Now, during the earliest days of the church, the first generation after Jesus, was believed, like I mentioned earlier, that Matthew the apostle was the author. A Greek bishop by the name of Papias. He was the bishop of Hierapolis in Turkey, and even during his lifetime, the 2nd century, relied on Mark, and in his mind it all made sense that Matthew was the apostle, the tax collector. So the next logical question is, where was Matthew's gospel written? Remember, we're being detectives. We're pretending like we've never heard Matthew before. We're pretending that we've never heard the church's view, we've never heard the legends. We're being detectives. And so who, what, where, how, and why are basic questions that we're going to be using when trying to study Matthew, trying to find out for sure what Matthew's gospel is all about. And so where was Matthew's gospel written? Now, Matthew's gospel, as we'll find out soon enough, is so Jewish in nature, and we'll talk about this later. A lot of scholars believe that Matthew wrote his gospel in Palestine or Syria, where that would have been logical. A lot of Jewish people there, he wouldn't have to translate a lot, all those different things. And that's true. But most scholars believe it was written in Antioch. And why do they say that? Well, a couple of reasons. Antioch is a town that Matthew mentions first in his gospel. It's also the center of the church as it's growing. Acts of the Apostles is all about Antioch. Paul, all these references to Antioch, it makes sense that Matthew would write his gospel there. And here's the kicker. Here's the second reason. Bishop Ignatius, Ignatius of Antioch, was the early bishop there, one of the first, if not the first bishop of the Church of Antioch. He lived during the early 2nd century, and he already is referencing Matthew's gospel to his epistles to the Smyrna. Are you ready to go down the rabbit hole of manuscripts? Let's go. So, all the books of the New Testament were written a lifetime after Jesus. And so all of these New Testament books that are in the Bible were written in the 1st century. So there are also these other Gospels that are not canonical. They're called the pseudepigraphical Gnostic works. Big word that means that they were written 2nd, 3rd century, and there's all kinds of theories, and well, they're written in a way that we know that they were not during the 1st or early 2nd century. They were written long after that. Okay, so 100 and 300 years later, after John's Gospel, it's obvious. But here's the kicker. We have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, of a pretty full, complete version of the books of the Bible and the New Testament. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so all these documents that we're talking about, written a lifetime after Jesus in the 1st century. The average size of the New Testament manuscript, just the weight of the earliest complete version, 450 pages. That's astounding when you compare the amount of manuscripts that we have for the Bible compared to anything else, any other ancient manuscript, Homer or anybody, any of the philosophers. We have more manuscripts from the 1st century than any other manuscript, any other literary form. And that is something when you talk about how dependable the Bible is, how dependable the Gospels are. And that's why we can put so much weight in them. I got a good word for you. Okay, are you ready? The next time you're at a party, I want you to use this word and then let me know how you use it and how it goes over. The word I'm talking about is oxyrhynchus. The Oxyrhynchus manuscript. And you might ask yourself, what is Oxyrhynchus? I'm pronouncing it wrong, I know I am. It's a town in Egypt, and that's where they found the earliest version of any gospel fragment of a manuscript. They believe that it was discovered in AD 4. Now let's not get carried away or start lining up the timeline with Jesus in AD 4. We'll get to that, so let's not worry about that. But anyway, the small fragment, they call it P90 or P104. That's how they label them. Written in Greek on both sides of the papyrus. Okay, it was John's Gospel, chapter 18, 36 through chapter 19:7, and that's the earliest one. AD 4. Can you imagine that? So it was found in this dump near Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. And so that's where they find these things. And you know what's crazy? These manuscripts that they find, they don't find them like just in some church. They've been finding them all over the place. Places like this, a dump. The Bedouins who have been there since long before Jesus, they've never left. They have all kinds of these things. And a lot of times they didn't know what they were. And so all of a sudden, in their marketplaces, these manuscripts start coming out and being found. And then the Bedouins, of course, beginning to realize what they have, they start negotiating a little bit with these archaeologists. And can you imagine how crazy it is to find the old manuscripts of the Bible in these crazy places like marketplaces and dumps? It's amazing. It's amazing how many we have, and it's amazing how we find them. So we were talking about Matthew's gospel. When was it written? Most scholars believe that Matthew wrote his gospel somewhere between the year 50 or 60 in the 1st century. It's hard to nail it down for sure. You know, carbon dating of these parchments starts coming into play. We start being able to use that. But the more favorable reason why we put Matthew's gospel being written between 50 and 60 is one of the church fathers, Irenaeus. And we have some of his writings. And he writes in one of his epistles, or one of his writings in the 1st century, he writes, quote, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. Here's Irenaeus in the 1st century talking about Matthew's gospel. And so Irenaeus, we know a lot about him, so we can date Matthew's gospel in the year 50 to 60, somewhere in there, with confidence. Okay, enough with the rabbit hole of the manuscripts. Let's move on to another question that we have to ask ourselves. Who was Matthew writing to? Who was his audience? What do we know about them? Well, it's widely accepted that Matthew was talking to Jews. He was talking to Jewish converts or potential converts. Why can we say that? Matthew talks in ways that Jewish people understand. He talks about the fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures, and he writes in a way that Jewish people would say, "Oh yeah, I understand that." If Luke would have been trying to talk to these Jewish people, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense. Because he wasn't using a lot of these themes that Jewish people know. That's what they've grown up with. The Sermon on the Mount, for example. Jesus is on a mountain. In Luke, he's on a plain. But Matthew, okay, so why the Sermon on the Mount? If you're a Jewish person, who else goes up on a mountain? Moses. Moses goes up on a mountain and gets the law from God. And so Matthew, in a very clever way, is introducing Jesus in a way that makes the Jewish people feel comfortable. Jesus goes up the mountain just like Moses did, gets the law, and he comes down, and we have the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. And so Matthew quotes the Hebrew scripture 62 times in his gospel, ratifying, emphasizing the Jewishness, trying to make these Jewish converts or potential converts comfortable with the idea of Jesus being the new Moses, the fulfillment of the new gospel. Now, these are Jewish people. Can you imagine how hard it would be for them to adapt their religion to this? It's so crazy. And so that's why Matthew is talking to Jewish people. He's trying to comfort them, bring them along, use language that they know, use symbols, use themes that Jewish people would know. That's why Matthew is so brilliant. That's why he's my favorite gospel writer. Here's another reason why we know that Matthew's speaking to a Jewish crowd is he doesn't explain things like Mark and Luke and John does. Matthew says things in Hebrew or Aramaic, and he doesn't bother translating them. Luke and Mark assume they don't understand. Their audience doesn't understand these Aramaic or Hebrew terms. And so Matthew says them, and he knows that his audience already understands them. And so he doesn't bother spending a lot of time or any time at all trying to tell us what this Hebrew or Aramaic thing is, because they already know it. Matthew uses the phrase, the kingdom of heaven. Now, this would have been right in the Jewish people's wheelhouse. It's a Jewish expression. They would have already been familiar with it. And now Matthew's applying it to Jesus, and so making them feel even more comfortable. This is an appropriate term that the Jewish people in that audience would grab onto. Matthew is brilliant at converting these Jewish people. It's brilliant. One final thing about Matthew's audience. He's trying to teach the Jews a couple of things, like he's trying to teach all of us, whether we're Jewish or not. He's trying to teach us that Jesus of Nazareth, this guy that they know, okay, it's a lifetime since Jesus' resurrection. They have heard about this guy, okay? This Jesus of Nazareth was the expected Messiah. This was the guy that they're waiting for. That he was it. Try to wrap your mind around that if you're a Jewish person. And all of a sudden, all the things you've studied all your life, all the things in the Hebrew scripture that you've been taught, all of a sudden, we're talking about this guy who was crucified, rose from the dead, ascended into heaven. He's the Messiah. Now, that would have been tough to convince people of. But Matthew, that's what he's trying to do. That's his goal. Another thing that Matthew does to talk to his Jewish audience, he talks about Jesus' genealogy. Look at Luke's genealogy compared to Jesus. Matthew is connecting Jesus to Moses and Abraham. Okay, we can talk about genealogies later. Okay, a lot of people have questions about that. But the mere fact that Matthew is trying to connect Jesus through Joseph, through Abraham, through Moses, all those different Hebrew scripture heroes for the Jewish people, he's making Jesus legitimate. He's legitimate. He's the Messiah. And these Jewish people, when they start listening to Matthew, they are tuning in, boy. They are locked in because Matthew is speaking their language. Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? We learned a lot of things. We learned about the theories of who Matthew was, the tax collector, the apostle. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Most scholars believe that he was. We learned about manuscripts. We went down the rabbit hole of manuscripts, and we learned about these early papyri fragments of the manuscripts, the earliest forms, and how many we have compared to all other English, all other literary forms of any language. We learned about that. We talked about Matthew's audience and who they were, the Jewishness of Matthew's audience. Matthew knew his audience, and he was using these hooks. He was dialing in on how to get these Jewish people and his audience attention, and he did it brilliantly. Well, thanks for joining me again today. This is our 4th episode. We're going to continue on with more. We're going to actually get in to Matthew's Gospel as we go. A couple of things that we're going to talk about is a historical event, the destruction of the temple, and how that played into Matthew's Gospel and why that was such a big deal. 60 AD, roughly, 63 AD, I believe. Anyway, you might think, okay, so the temple's gone. Oh, no. It's much bigger than that. So we're going to talk about the timing of the destruction of the temple. And we're going to get into Matthew's Gospel. Again, I want to thank you all for leaving your comments below. Also, you can email me, jkirby1@me.com. I appreciate all your input, and I want to make this as audience friendly as we can and try to do more, trying to improve things as we go. So I appreciate it, and we'll look forward to having you back for a deep dive into Matthew's Gospel. Let Matthew be Matthew.